Hey, this is Corey. Today we're going to talk about how I built a $300K per year business as a solo designer by selling strategy, not execution. So let's get into it. Today I'm going to tell you about how I built my $300K per year business as a solo designer. I'm going to tell you how I went from being a design executor to being seen as a strategic partner. First, let's talk about the business and let's talk about what I've achieved so far. So how do I work? The way I work is I'm a solo designer, but I occasionally have freelance partners. So my work is usually a mix of projects and retainers. And I have a very lean business, which means I have very low overhead, giving me lots of freedom in what I do. And clients hire me for my expertise and my unique value, which gives me very high leverage. I use that leverage to create very premium value-based pricing and charge, rates that really push my worth, right? Along with that, I don't do RFPs, don't do hard selling, just conversations. Most of my client acquisition is going through nurturing and conversations. And with all that, I choose the projects that I want to work on and the people that I want to work with. So let's talk about the results. So I currently do 20K plus per month revenue, and I've hit 300K total revenue over a year. And that revenue, 300K total revenue per year, is about 4.5 times my previous full-time salary when I first started freelancing. So before this, I had a full-time job and then I went to freelance and I was able to achieve these numbers. And during that period, I've been able to achieve 30K plus average client LTV, lifetime value, over 12 months. So that means that when I acquire a client, on average, I'm getting about 30K worth of project work from that client. And that's translating into about 85 to 90% profit margin. So my projects have really high value and they're coming from nurtured inbound requests, right? None of these cold calling leads. It's really about attracting very high quality customers and high quality clients rather than going for quantity. And because I have a very high quality inbound nurtured requests from clients and I have a very high satisfaction rate, this ends up converting to a very high referral rate. And this referral rate creates a very strong organic network. So as I acquire clients, those clients refer me to other people, and then those clients refer me to other people. And then I kind of built this pipeline of referrals and building my network there. And through all this, I've been able to position myself as a very strategic and respected partner. So let's talk about my core philosophies, what drives me, the actions I take, and how I kind of build my business. So I can break this down into 4 different things here. First one is having a solutions mindset. So I come in thinking about how to diagnose problems, right? I'm not thinking about how do I sell services to people? I'm thinking about what is their problem and how do I diagnose it? How do I provide a solution? How do I get them to an outcome? How do I show clear ROI? So this is what frames my mindset and all my conversations and all the work I do. So along with that, number 2, high intent prospects, right? So I only want to work with prospects who come to me for me, people who come to me for my specific expertise, someone who I've nurtured through my content, through the conversations I've had, because I don't want to hard sell them on something I don't want to provide. I don't want to work for someone who doesn't value my expertise and doesn't see me as a unique service provider compared to everyone else, right? So this is where I think how I kind of qualified my prospects here. Number 3, let's talk about pricing. So by being able to create this pipeline of high intent prospects, I can use that as leverage to charge premium pricing, right? So as a designer, I don't want to charge, a very low rate. I don't even want to charge average rates. I want to charge, the best rates I can possible, right? So I use my leverage to command premium pricing and create a very unique positioning, right? So I want to be a kind of market of one where I don't want to be a commodity. I want to be in a position where clients come to me for my unique value and there isn't really a comparable alternative. Again, this is all about leverage. And the 4th one is all about quality and consistency, right? So with my service, I'm creating essentially a promise, right? I'm trying to get my clients to an outcome. I'm trying to get my clients an ROI on the money they've invested and paying me to build these things, right? I want to deliver on that promise with high quality output and consistent output, right? The way I do that is by building frameworks and systems and processes to deliver consistently this high quality service that evolves over time. So these are my 4 core philosophies that really kind of drive the direction of my business. Now let's talk about who am I? You're probably like, hey, who is this Corey dude? What does he do? Where did he come from? First, my background. I'm a designer in tech. So I've been working in technology companies for the past 15 years. Say more specifically, you can call me a product designer. I've worked as a product designer throughout that period. And I've worked in everything from small startups to very mature enterprise to even some companies that you probably know the name of. During that time, I've also had a lot of different roles. So I've come from being a solo founding designer to being a design lead to even being a CDO to also now being a freelance design consultant, right? So having many different experiences in different roles. And I'm also based in Tokyo, Japan, by the way. All right, so let's talk about my story. Where did I come from and how did I get to where I am today? As a designer, originally I was really focused on improving my hard skills. Always thinking about how do I get better at design? How do I, create more polished design, more usable, more intuitive UX and things like that, right? But as I went through my career, I started to realize the importance of soft skills. I started to realize the importance of communication and strategy, right? So as I was kind of going through different roles, I started to focus on communication and strategy. And I realized the more I leaned into that, the more I was able to kind of get trust and I was able to kind of get the resources I needed to execute my design, right? So I was able to put myself in the position of not just being an executor, but being someone who was trusted to think strategically about things. And by doing that, the leadership always gave me opportunities to kind of drive projects forward. So that created kind of a feedback loop where I was thinking like, okay, communication and strategy gives me more opportunities, gives me more authority in the space to lead. And so why don't I lean into this, right? So the reason why this happens is because speaking the language of business obviously resonates with business leaders, right? When you're talking about design details, if you're not a designer, most people don't understand that. It doesn't resonate with them. But when you're talking to a person who is a business leader and you're talking to them about strategy, you're talking to them about ROI and growth and things like that, those are all things that resonate with them. Those are all things that are like, it's in their language. You are in their space, right? So because you're speaking the same language, then it's much easier to build trust and you're actually seen not just as someone who can execute and create things, but you're seen as someone who can really drive the business. And that was where I kind of started realizing the power of communication and strategy. And I used that to bridge business strategy and execution to get to quantifiable results, which is something that I think a lot of people miss out in, and that a lot of people are on the business side or a lot of people are on the execution side. And there aren't really a lot of people in the middle kind of tying that together. So I was kind of positioning myself as the core strength of being able to do both, right? And so this is the kind of the start of my journey here. So kind of breaking this down even further, this is really what I think the kind of maturity journey of designers is as you kind of level up your skills. So I started on the execution, doing all the kind of hard skills in kind of polishing my output there, then realizing I needed to be a better communicator to lead and facilitate the work. And then finally realizing that, I need to understand strategy to really kind of drive business results. And this comes down to something that I think is really important, which is I believe that if you're not setting the strategy, if you're not driving the strategy, you don't own your design. So what I mean by that is that basically as a designer, your design is only as good as the strategy that's behind it, right? If you can't affect the strategy, you can't maximize the potential of your design. And for me, that's the driving motivator for really why I want to be involved in strategy. I really want to create great design. I really want to create, amazing products. But if I don't have an influence over the strategy, I'm always limited by that. So that was my realization of why I should really kind of embrace this. Okay, so that brings me to the next chapter, going from execution to consulting and strategy, right? So as I started to lean more into these soft skills, I started to understand that business leaders think of outcomes. They think about what's the result I want to get to. As I started to speak that language more and tried to focus more on understanding how to build strategy that leads to business results, I was able to kind of build more trust and get more buy-in. And then through this, I was able to also understand that my skills as a designer could translate to other areas of the business. I could use design skills and design thinking and other ways to create strategy and create results in the business. So that was where I started to really realize that, hey, maybe there's something here. Maybe there's something different that I can do with design that provides more value. So I got this idea where I thought, well, what if I sold design as strategy, right? Instead of selling design as an execution, something that is just output, I wanted to sell design as something that really, really drives the business. So that's what I did. So I did this by starting my freelance business and trying to get my first client. So at this time, I was still working as a full-time employee in a startup, but I did get an inbound lead for a design project. And the way I kind of handled this lead was I led with a consulting approach. Instead of being, say, the typical service-based provider where someone comes to you and says, hey, you're a designer, can you design things for me? And you pull out a whole menu and you say, hey, these are all the things I can do. I changed my approach to thinking about the consulting approach. I thought about, hey, well, let me first understand their business. Let me first understand their context and work with them to define what their business could be. And this is, again, all framed on my thinking about strategy first, thinking about the business first. I wanted to understand what the problem was and understand what the desirable outcome would be for that business. And then from there, I worked together with the prospect to define, basically connect the dots from where they wanted to go with the business into what we can actually do with execution to get them there, right? And that basically scoped the project, right? So instead of someone coming to you and saying, hey, Corey, I want you to design a logo and build a landing page, I said, hey, wait, let's think about what you really want to do. What are you trying to achieve in your business? Understood that, scoped out the end result, and said, hey, actually, to get there, here are the deliverables that you need. Here is the execution that you need that's actually going to move the needle. And that is how I landed my first client, because they saw that the way I thought, the way I approached communication and strategy as a designer was very, very different from anyone else they had ever interacted with, which gave them a lot of confidence that I would be able to get them to that result. And as a result, they hired me for that. But this engagement was very, very different, right? Most people would dive straight into, opening up Figma and creating design, right? But for me, because I had started with strategy, that's where the project started. I actually spent the first 2 months defining strategy. I was defining the product positioning. I was defining the offering. I was trying to change the value perception of the business and doing all these things on the business strategy side. Of course, this is my first time doing this, so a lot of it was trying to understand, like, how do I put together a framework for strategy and getting to that result, because I hadn't ever kind of provided that as a service to a client. But I guess the key point here is that, the client was paying me just to think strategically about their business and write a strategy. And that made up a significant portion of my overall kind of billable project fee, right? So I was able to charge much more because I was offering strategy rather than offering just execution only, right? And so what that resulted in was basically a very, very different project scope from what they had initially planned. They had initially planned a much smaller project scope just based around some basic rebranding execution. And because I was able to define a clear strategy for what they needed, they realized that, hey, we don't just need, say, some branding and some kind of like, basic assets to kind of change the look and feel of the service. We need a more holistic approach to make sure we can execute this strategy. And what that translated to was over 60K at LTV from that first client in 12 months, that's a very, very good project fee, I think, for, your first freelance project. And what that did was it gave me the runway to quit my full-time job. When I say runway, that was like obviously the capital, because that was closing in on what I was making, per year at that time. But also it gave me the confidence, right? Gave me the confidence that, hey, actually I could do this. I could, really serve clients in a way that provides value, and I could set myself apart in the market. So that's really how I kind of got my start kicking off my first client and transitioning into a full-time freelance and being a design service provider, right? And along with that, obviously, it was a win-win for both of us. Not only did I deliver on the project, but we got to a great outcome and we launched the service, and that led to a 20% month-over-month growth for the first 3 months of that relaunch for the service, right? So this is all kind of in summary. This is how much strategy can affect your business as a designer. You can really define the direction of what you execute, and you can really change someone's business, but also you can receive a lot of value from yourself. You can build a premium because you're doing something that's going to really drive ROI, right? So this is really how I got started and started thinking about how do I scale this up, right? So after a few projects over the years, I started to think about how do I kind of make my own framework so I can repeat this and I can keep the quality and consistency over time. So I came up with my own framework, which I call the Designer MBA. And the Designer MBA is basically a practical framework for strategic design. So all these lessons and all these insights I learned over the years trying to create strategic design, I put this into one clear framework so I can repeat it and I could scale that to any client in any industry at any time, right? So let's talk about the details of this. Let's get into what is actually in the Designer MBA. So the Designer MBA consists of 4 main components. So the first one is think, second, communicate, third, execute, and then operate. Let's break this down further. So think is all about strategic positioning. How do you position yourself as a designer to not be an executor, but to be a strategic partner to business owners, right? And also, how do you think about design more strategically? How do you connect design to business, right? The second one is communicate. So obviously communication is a huge part of being a great service provider and a great leader to business owners. So with the communicate component, it's all about value-based client acquisition. So how do you go from charging per hour to charging based on value provided, right? When we talked about before ROI, how do you define the potential ROI of your work, and how do you charge, say, a portion of that to command more premium rates there? But as well as that is also the framing of the services you provide. How do you frame yourself, not as an executor, but how do you frame yourself as someone who can contribute to the business and drive strategy towards an outcome? So the next one is execute. Execute is all about how do you actually take that strategic design and put it into practice. So for this, I actually came up with another framework for building design strategy from scratch, and this is called outcome-driven design strategy. Basically, how you define an outcome and how you get there through design. The last one is operate. So building a design business is, I think, fundamentally very, very different from your traditional execution-centric design business where people sell just execution as a service. This is a very different business. So there are some key things in here that you need to think about as you scale your business. All right, so let's break down each of these and I'll kind of go through the details. So the first one, strategic positioning. Don't sell design, sell strategy for outcomes. This is very, very important, right? The reason why is because design doesn't sell. So the reason why design doesn't sell is because design is just execution. It doesn't lead directly to outcomes without any strategy, right? So when we think about, say, your typical, say, design freelancer agency, they usually have a huge menu of things that they provide. They provide branding, they provide marketing, and the landing pages, and UI, UX, and social assets, and just everything right under the sun. And the problem with that is that by just showing someone a list of services, a menu of services, you're asking them to self-prescribe what they need, right? It's like asking a patient to self-prescribe their medication. If this patient says, hey, my stomach hurts, and they have to go in to the doctor and say, hey, you need to give me these painkillers, right? Because they're not a doctor and they're self-prescribing, there's a very high risk that they could choose a medication that's not actually going to solve their pain. Maybe they buy those painkillers and their stomach pain goes away for a little while, but what happens is that eventually it comes back. And then they realize that, hey, that medicine wasn't working out for me. And what happens, this is the worst thing of all, is that they lose faith in that medicine could be effective at all. So this is exactly what happens in design. So designers come and they say, hey, here's my menu of all my services. Pick anything you like, right? And then the client self-prescribes what they need. The client buys that service, that execution from the designer executes that, and then they realize that, hey, actually, this design that I paid for didn't really solve my problem. It didn't really get me to an outcome in my business. And what happens from there is that they realize that, hey, well, maybe design isn't something that's effective, right? And as a design provider, you don't want someone to think that, right? You understand that design can be very effective to driving business outcomes. But if people start to think about that, then you're putting yourself in a very precarious position for your business because people will stop having interest in buying design from you, right? So this is why I say design doesn't sell. What does sell is strategy, right? So strategy is all about diagnosing what their problems are and giving them a clear, say, road towards an outcome. This is what gives them the confidence to buy. When you come in as a doctor and you say, hey, let me diagnose you to make sure you get the right medication to get to solve your core illness, not just treat the symptoms, then people start to listen, people start to notice, and they trust you, right? So that's why I say that, selling strategy is actually what sells better than design. Right? So strategy is a clear diagnosis and a framework for achieving business outcomes. So let's talk about positioning yourself as a strategic partner versus a service provider. So if we think of, say, all the design freelancers and all design agencies in the world, there are a ton of them, right? Even if you narrow it down to just the market you serve and the language you serve, there are so many people that you're going to be competing against, right? It's a very, very crowded market. And that's a really challenging thing to come against, right? Like, so how do you set yourself apart from everyone else? The way we do this is actually by selling strategy again, right? By selling strategy and again, being the person who can diagnose problems in businesses and get them towards outcomes, you are looked at as a strategic partner. And what that does is that sets you apart in the market. So maybe you're here on the left before as an executor, but as you transition over to becoming a more strategic designer, what happens is that prospects, your potential clients, when they speak to you, to interact with you, they'll look at you and think that, well, this person is maybe a designer, but they seem fundamentally different from everyone else in the market. There's something different about them, the way they can speak to me in the same language, the way they can drive outcomes. And what this does is that moves you to a completely different category. You're no longer just at your average design executor, right? You are someone who is in a very, very different space, providing a very, very different thing. What this allows you to do is what allows you to build leverage, right? Because your prospects or your potential clients can't compare you to everyone else because there really isn't a comparable alternative. Not many people are actually working in this space. Not many people can actually achieve these results with strategy. Of course, I'm going to teach you how to do that. And if you can do that successfully, you're going to put yourself into a separate market where you're essentially a market of one and you don't have a comparable alternative. And that's the key to everything here today, of really being able to be seen as a partner and someone who can command rates that are based on ROI, not, hourly work and things like that. All right, so let's summarize this. First, you need to think like a strategic partner, not an executor. So you need to think about how you serve your customers. You need to think about how you diagnose their problems and get them to outcomes. And you do that via strategy, right? That strategy leads to business outcomes and gives you leverage to charge rates based on ROI, not based on hours. So let's talk about the next section here. Let's talk about value-based client acquisition. So this is all about communication. And when it comes to communication, the most important thing when it comes to acquiring clients is leverage. We need leverage, and more leverage. So how do you build leverage? Well, the way I do it is through nurturing. Instead of just doing, say, cold calls and cold outreach, what I do is I nurture prospects and existing clients to build my pipeline. This could be either through conversations or through content. What I'm doing here is I'm selling my vision. I'm selling my strategy, showing them how I think, but I'm also showing them the potential of their business and getting them to buy into that, right? So when people kind of buy into my methodology and my way of thinking, then that aligns them much closer to my ideal client, right? While I'm doing that, what I like to do is if I'm having these, say, one-on-one conversations with potential clients, then I'll work with them to identify opportunities and define the scope. So we talked about previously about clients self-prescribing, right? So this is where you do the opposite, where you're diagnosing. Instead of just providing what they ask you to provide, you're defining from business strategy what they actually need. And then via that definition, you're using that to scope projects, right? And this goes into the next point, which is very, very important. Don't try to close low value deals. And I see this all the time with a lot of freelancers. This is kind of like a classic sales mistake where people are very excited that someone says yes to them and that someone says, yes, I want to buy. And they jump straight into selling them the lowest value thing they could, right? Because they don't have the confidence to do what I call expanding the deal or expanding the scope. So this again goes into how you serve your clients, right? If you really want to get your clients to outcomes, you have to make sure that what is in the project scope is actually what they need to get to that outcome, right? And if it is not what they need to get to that outcome, then you need to expand the scope to include that to make sure that they can get there, right? And what this does is, again, this is another win-win scenario for both. If you have an appropriate scope for your project for execution that's going to get them to outcome, that's going to be a positive result, right? But also as a service provider, you're able to expand the scope into a high value project, right? And I think that's what you want. You don't want lots of clients at very low value coming to you. You want people coming to you for maybe a smaller quantity for a higher project value, right? So this is where nurturing comes into this value-based client acquisition. So next point is very important as well. Don't sell what it is, sell what it solves, right? So it's all about serving your client, right? Serving them to get to an outcome. So when we think about just design execution, if you say, I do branding, I do logo creation, I do slide deck creation, presentation, whatever, that's selling what it is, right? If you're diagnosing someone and saying, hey, you need to acquire customers in this new market who are this demographic, that's selling what it solves. That's that outcome, right? So you always have to think about like, what does your service do for them? How does it get them there? That's how you should be framing your conversations. So this leads into your offering, right? So when you're structuring your offering, this has a lot of effect on how much value you could charge to your client, right? So when it comes to offering, there's three main points. The first one is you need to have a very clear outcome for the client, right? Again, you don't want someone just coming to you and buying services just because you have a menu. You want them to have a clear problem. So you want to define the problem, diagnose it, and then you want to be providing a solution that's going to get them to an outcome, right? So having a clear outcome for the client is the first thing of having a strong offering. The second one is having a structured method for delivery, right? So even if you just define what the outcome is, you need to make sure that you can get there, right? And this is where processes and frameworks come in. And these are things that guarantee that your execution will get results. And the last part is confidence in you as a partner, right? So you want them to have confidence that you are the person who can deliver on this, right? And you demonstrate this through your expertise and how you speak their language. And this last part is really done actually before you even close a deal, right? It's usually done during the nurturing phase. You know, as you're having conversations with people, as you're putting out content and exposing them to your ideas, your vision, the way you think in your frameworks and things like that, those are all building confidence in you as a partner. And then they're looking at your method for delivery. And then once they talk to you one-on-one and you scope a project, you're just, defining a clear outcome for the client. So these are the three things that you need to have a very clear, very strong offering and being able to charge based on value, not on hours. Along with that, you always need to have a vision worth striving for. So we talked about that outcome. The outcome has to be a really kind of attractive picture that they can't resist, right? So your client should be looking at that outcome, that vision, and being like, yeah, that's exactly what I want. This is where I want to take my business. That gets me excited, right? You need to get them excited about where their business could go. And then once you have them excited, then the only questions left are, well, how do I get there? And what does it cost? Right? How do I get there is you have your frameworks and your processes. If you have those set, then that answers that, right? And then what it costs, and then that's just charging a fraction of the ROI. That's your leverage there, right? So you're getting them to buy into the vision that they want, and then you just need to sell them on this is how much it costs to get there. It's a very, very different framing than just selling design because it isn't really comparable, right? If someone's comparing how much it costs you to create a logo versus another person, that's an easy comparison. But if someone's saying, hey, here's a vision, I can get you there, and no one else is doing that, there isn't really cost comparison. And this is how we're able to charge based on value provided, not on hours. So again, price, value, not hours. ROI is your rate. Return on investment is your rate. So the reason I say that is because if you're driven by an outcome, that outcome has a value to it. So if your outcome will help them, say, gain 100K in sales, you can think about, well, what is a reasonable fraction of that value that I could charge to have a high ROI for them? If I charged 10K for this project and this project could generate 100K, that's 10x ROI for the client. That's a very attractive thing, right? So for anybody who's running a business, if you told them, if you invested 10K, you can get 100K back over the next few months, I think everyone would take that deal, right? As long as they had the 10K that they could afford, right? So your ROI is always a fraction of the value that you provide. And this way, it's not a conversation of like, how many hours did you work? Because if there's a clear ROI, no one really cares about that. No one cares that it took you 5 hours or even 1 hour to do that. You could theoretically make $10,000 an hour if that $10,000 an hour has a high ROI, a multiple of that, right? So this is where value-based pricing wins over hours every single time. And this is how you can really build a strong business as a solo design operator, not an agency, and scale just your expertise, right? Let's talk about the next part. Let's talk about outcome-driven design strategy. So this is all about how you execute this in practice. So to do that, I've come up with my own strategy, my own framework for getting to repeatable results. So a lot of designers who are just heavily focused on execution, they're hoping that their design will achieve results, that they'll get to quantifiable outcomes. And hope is not a strategy, right? You don't want to be selling someone on an outcome, but not being able to back that up, not being able to deliver that consistently, right? So instead of hoping that you'll get there, you need a strategy. You need a framework to get you there reliably and have quality, consistent results. So what I've done is I've created my own framework for how I build strategy. So this is outcome-driven design strategy. By the name of it, basically, it means that you're getting a client to an outcome and you're using strategy and design to get there, right? So let's break this down. So the first part is context. Everything starts from context. You need to understand the business, the customer, the market, everything around the business, everything that could affect your strategy. You need to start by understanding that, right? So context is the first step in this process. The second step in this process of building strategy is identifying opportunities, right? So you need to find opportunities to differentiate and create new value, right? So if you're in a crowded market, how do you set this business apart and put them in a different space? How do you offer something that is different? How do you offer something that adds new value and things like that? So identifying these opportunities to differentiate and create new value is, the second step that builds on that understanding. If you don't understand the context, obviously you can't, define opportunities. And from there, what we do is we build a hypothesis. The hypothesis is basically your unique position and your value proposition, right? So you say that, hey, there's a lot of opportunities in this space. Most people are operating in this space, but there's a gap over here. So our hypothesis is that if we fill that gap over here and we offer this new value, that we can capture a new market or we can capture a different segment of the existing market, right? So that's your hypothesis that you set. And to guide this hypothesis, you need themes, right? So this is something a lot of people skip. A lot of people go straight to tactics and executing things, but themes is actually one of the most important things for building, durable long-term strategy. What themes are basically the rules that guide your execution. So this is basically looking at your hypothesis. You set some rules that say that, well, to get to this hypothesis, we're always going to follow these guidelines. We're going to do these things because of these reasons, and we're going to do it in this way. So over time, your tactics and things like that, new things will pop up, but you want to always make sure that they align to your themes. So themes is just setting the rules that guide your execution over time. And the last part is tactics, right? So tactics is just clear actions to execute, right? So based on all this context, we're going to run this campaign, we're going to create this design, this new feature, etc. These are the actions that will lead to really kind of driving those outcomes. But everything needs to connect to each other, right? Tactics need to connect to align to themes, align to your hypothesis, and make sure that they're taking advantage of the opportunities in the market that are based on context that you've built, right? So this is the fundamentals of how you build a design-driven strategy. And if you kind of look at this here overall, you might be thinking like, where is the design? What's so unique about this? Well, that's unique about this is actually that it's focused on the business, right? So most designers are focused too much on design and not thinking about business strategy. This framework actually starts from the business side. So what it does is allows you to communicate in terms that business leaders, people on the other side of the fence will understand. Again, you're speaking that shared language and being able to kind of translate that across different boundaries, right? So this aligns everyone. And then from your kind of thought process of how you think about things, naturally as a designer, you're going to think about it through the lens of design. You're going to think about your tactics on what you can actually execute as a designer in that space. So let's kind of wrap this up here. So outcome-driven design framework is my kind of business strategy-centric design approach for how you speak the language of business, right? So how you speak to business leaders and how you show them that you can get to results, right? You can deliver on your promise. And what this does is it guarantees consistent quality of results, and it also gives them confidence in your method. They see that you have a structured method and it seems like it's, very sound, seems very feasible. They're confident in you as a provider in your method enough that they're going to say, sign you for the project, right? And give you what you need to lead that. Okay, let's talk about the last part. This last one is strategic design, business scaling, and it's all about operations. What's really important here is design your business. So most designers, whether you're a freelance designer, even agency owners, most people I see, they're not actually designing their business. They're not building their business the same way they're building products. They'll spend a lot of time thinking about building other people's businesses, but they don't actually spend too much time building their own. So this is an important step when it comes to scaling your business and providing higher quality over time. So scaling your business, scaling a strategic design business is all about these 4 things. The first one is processes. And so processes are all about efficiency. How do you structure how you operate in a way to be more efficient over time? Because if you're more efficient over time, you can be more effective, you can be faster, and you can deliver more and things like that, right? Along with that, you want frameworks for repeatable results. Like we talked about before, the design-driven strategy approach is basically a framework to get to repeatable results for defining strategy, right? So whatever your core offering is, you want to make sure you have a framework behind that so that you can provide the same high quality service to every single client. And then from that, we also want to think about tooling, right? So thinking about different tools to help you speed up your workflow, to help you scale and also increase quality as well. And the last part is templates, right? So a lot of work you do will be maybe repetitive work. You're having one offering that you're providing to many different businesses. Because it's the same offering, the start point is the same, maybe the end point is the same as well. So if you can create templates for whatever deliverables you have, that's going to not only make your process more efficient, it's also going to increase the perceived value from the client side. They're going to see something that's much more refined, much more polished than if you're doing everything bespoke from scratch without templates, right? So these are all things that are important on scaling your business. If you're able to invest in these things over time, you'll see lots of results on how much you speed up and you can work less, and you'll end up being able to charge more for your work because it would be even higher quality than it was before. So yeah, that's basically the overview of the Designer MBA. But next I want to talk about my business setup in that context, right? So how I went from just being a designer to now being seen as a strategic partner in business by using the Designer MBA framework. Okay, so let's talk about the first one, strategic positioning again. So how I actually work in that context. Well, when it comes to positioning, I define who I want to work with, right? So I work with primarily businesses that want a change, that want to pivot, right? Or some kind of acceleration. They're making a large change in their business, that they're trying to start something new. And for me, as someone who provides strategy, that is the best place to come in because I can see very quantifiable results, right? Very, very quickly versus doing something that's in a very small scope, that's not trying to make a change, it's just trying to optimize things. You'll probably see smaller results. And for me, that's not a project space that's very attractive. I scope my work based on the clients that I want to work with, that I think I can provide the highest value. And along with that, so that goes into how I work, right? So I always focus on providing my unique value, which is strategy, and then delegate anything that's non-critical when it comes to execution, right? So if my primary value-driven offering is strategy, a lot of execution could be done by someone else. And I often do that as well. So even as a designer, a lot of teams I work with, they'll have their own designers and they'll still bring me on board to drive a project because I have the strategy element that their team does not have, right? So I'll often drive strategy while I'll delegate or I'll kind of facilitate internal design teams on what they should execute to get to that end result. Or sometimes I'll bring in a freelancer as support for that to execute on the design part while I focus on strategy. Back to value-based client acquisition. So when we talk about nurturing over selling, the way I use it is I start conversations with potential clients. If I see a business that interests me or someone contacts me from a business that I think would be a great client, then I set up a conversation with them to understand their business. And I use that to kind of nurture the clients over time. So even if I don't say close a deal specifically at that time, I'm working with the client to define a project scope and define what their problem is. Again, diagnosing and trying to show an outcome and where their business could be. And so these conversations will usually come back and go into a project scope of a very high intent prospect, right? Where a client is coming to me because we had a specific conversation about a specific execution that could lead to an outcome. So they're very excited to work with me specifically. And this is how I can convert these clients very well. And this is not just one-on-one conversations. Sometimes it is through content that I put out a lot of content, put out a lot of resources that are helpful for framing strategy and thinking for businesses. And they'll see that and they'll be attracted to that and come back to me to execute, right? So on ROI, I also am very careful about not accepting projects where the ROI is unclear. If someone comes to me and says, hey, can you do these things? And I don't see that, or I don't feel that it's going to connect to an outcome in their business, then I'll decline those projects, right? Because I only want to work in spaces where I can demonstrate clear ROI, because that ROI gets them to an outcome and provides value, right? I only want to charge for things that I can create value from. And also the more value I create, that goes back into raising the satisfaction of my clients and them referring more clients over time, building my pipeline of high quality clients where I can charge a premium value-based rate. Which goes into this last point here about value-based pricing. So I always try to provide a unique offering and, command premium rates. I don't want to provide just basic design services, because then again, I'm very much compared to that whole large market of many different freelancers and agencies. And instead of competing with that, I want to be in a space where I'm not competing with anyone and I'm just charging for my unique offering. So the way I do that is I never charge hourly rates. I only charge on fixed project-based pricing or monthly retainers. And even retainers are only based more on outcomes than hours worked. Yeah, and that's how I manage my business on the value-based client acquisition side. And let's talk about the outcome-driven design framework. So obviously we went through the framework there before, and you understand the kind of fundamentals of that framework. But yeah, the reason I created this framework was to show my unique value. This shows how I think. This puts me in a different space and creates my positioning. But this also gives me a way to, provide clarity and confidence in my clients that I can get them to an outcome. This framework also has the bonus that it can be done or applied in different contexts. So you can have that done for you, where I just create the strategy for the client on my own, or done with you, where we do things like workshops together to figure out and build a strategy together. Or I can even package it as a DIY, where I give them a template or a worksheet and they just create it themselves, right? And this all rolls into really increasing my unique value. And the last part is strategic design, business scaling. Yeah, so we talked about processes for efficiency. I have lots of different processes, from project kickoff to launch flows. I have processes for client comms and scheduling and things like that. Yeah, and when it comes to frameworks, we just talked about the outcome-driven design strategy, and that is one of them that I use to get to repeatable results. I use workshops and many other things that I've kind of codified over time to make sure that I can ensure quality and ensure results. And the next one, tooling for speeding scale. So in my business, I leverage a lot of AI tools and things like that, like Claude or Cursor and things to, improve the quality of my output and also streamline things. I use lots of automation. Sometimes I write custom scripts as well. And a lot of these things are built around processing deliverables, right? So deliverables are something that you always need to provide, right? And it can be a kind of monotonous process to create these things, right? To package these things in a way that everyone can use and it's polished. So what I do is I try to automate some of that to make sure that my deliverables always have very high quality, but everything is packaged in a way that I'm never missing anything, right? So this comes to design assets or content and things like that. And along with that, when it comes to managing things, I do managing tasks, clients and prospects and stuff like that. I use tools like Linear for task management, Cal.com for scheduling, and combining that with Notion just to make sure I can set meetings and make sure my availability is there and stuff like that. So many different tools I'm using just to kind of manage my business and make sure everything's, moving along at a really good flow. And the last part is templates for deliverables, right? So if you're a designer, obviously you're always going to be delivering some kind of design asset in most cases. So you should have a template for everything that you deliver, because that makes it easier if you're going to do this many times. But also, again, that polish increases the perceived value of your service. If you just slap a logo down on paper, then, it's not really exciting. But if you have some really good mocks and you kind of present it in a really good way, suddenly that logo looks like, tens of thousands of dollars of work, right? So that's what you want to do for all of your work. Whatever it is, you want to package it in a way with a template that you make, or even if you purchase something, but just use some template to present your work in a way that makes it look even better, but also reduces your work overall, right? So I build templates for things like design presentations, when I'm presenting UI, UX design, presenting brand design, when I'm handing off brand guidelines, I do things like that, or design systems, etc. So I have templates for all these different things just to make sure that, again, I'm presenting my work in the highest quality, as well as, connecting into the strategy. So that's how I shifted from being a design executor to being seen as a strategic partner in building my business as a solo designer. Through this, I've been able to, again, position myself as a respected partner for business leaders, being able to lead with strategy rather than just execution and drive businesses towards outcomes. By doing that, I've been able to build a very high profit business. I command, very premium rates that I charge based on value. Often charge rates that are much, much higher than your average designer because I'm in a very, very different space than, say, your average provider. Along with that, I focus on really delivering my service with very high quality at a very consistent rate. So I build a lot of frameworks and processes to make sure my output, whatever I deliver, is always at a very high quality, but also that whatever I create continues to increase in quality over time. And the last part is building a sustainable business, right? Thinking about how do I scale my business? How do I make things easier over time so I can kind of sustain this momentum and not burn out over things? And that was really the processes, the frameworks and the templates and things like that. Just designing my business itself is something that I always want to focus on. The gist of it, that's how I built a 300K per year business as a solo designer using my framework, the Designer MBA. So if this content was helpful for you, you should definitely check out my Instagram where I'm posting more content about how to position yourself as a strategic business partner in design, as well as practice YouTube channel. Thank you.